Hi there, alongside Tami, my assistant. I'm Dr. Rob, and you're listening to the Dental Formulator's Playbook, where we talk about everything from ideation to market success of oral care formulations like toothpaste, mouthwash. Along the way, we share stories, histories, present insight into various topics as they relate to oral care, even ones that might be highly charged. Tips, tricks, and frustrations are promised to be included.
In a prior episode, you mentioned the first effective fluoride toothpaste was created mid 1950s.
That's right.
So, say a prospective client reaches out and wants to have their own oral care brand, beginning with a toothpaste. How do you start?
Yeah, that sounds simple, right? No, this is a loaded request.
How so? It's just toothpaste.
Yeah, if only. The first thing I would clarify is what is the toothpaste going to do? Sometimes there's the request, hey, I want it to do everything, like a Colgate Total. Sometimes there's not the desire for fluoride. Sometimes people want it completely natural, or they want it to remineralize. Oh boy, remineralize. That's a sensitive word, and there's some debate about how this is treated, not only from a scientific point of view, but also from a regulatory one. Still, I would handle this the same with everything, with any paste that would be created. Make sure you have quality data to support your claims. We'll discuss how to do that in other episodes, and we'll touch on it at the end of this one.
Okay, so wait, you just introduced regulatory, which sounds important. Are toothpaste regulated?
Yes.
So, what's the story about that?
Yeah, it's complicated. So I actually had to begin with the ADA because the ADA is actually older than the FDA.
Seriously.
Yeah, it's about 93 years old, they say, and the FDA wasn't formally put into practice until until some issues were ultimately facing the agency. I think one of the more famous ones I think was the lidomide 1960s drug issue where pregnant women were giving birth to babies with major defects, and this was all over the world. So the FDA eventually came into being as it's now known, but beginning in the 1932, because I mentioned the ADA, this was their stance and position on toothpaste because they have their own separate Council on Dental Therapeutics. That's like a subdivision within the ADA. And they said, quote, this is their statement, an agent that may aid the toothbrush in cleaning the surfaces of the teeth. Beyond this, the toothpaste has no further function, end quote. So you can see at that time the FDA didn't didn't exist in any kind of formal way, and really to have that kind of statement from the ADA was the best that essentially the industry had. So, and we're going to talk more about the ADA, yeah, as we progress here.
Okay, so when you talked about the fluoride toothpaste success in the mid 1950s, that was a big deal.
Yeah, so that was a big deal. So I mentioned the FDA. So let's talk about them. So in 1908, the Food and Drug Act stipulated that foods, drinks, and drugs had to be properly labeled and not tainted for interstate commerce. So really, if somebody was in Illinois and they wanted to, make a product and sell it in Kentucky, that everything had to be truthful. That's nice that they said that, but again, maintenance, you know, who's overseeing all this stuff? And so there were some issues, and then a new drug law was passed in 1938. It was the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, right? And that required new drugs to demonstrate efficacy before approval of sale could be given. Refinements were then made regarding the quality, really, like the good manufacturing practices, which came into being really in 1941. There was a specific plan for that. And then prescription drugs were separated from over the counter drugs in 1951. And then in drug makers, they had to have specific amendments that were done in 1962. And again, this is following that the lidomide kind of it was just awful at that time. They had all these amendments that came out that said, look, you need to prove efficacy, but you also need to list potential side effects. I think that was a really big deal. So with all these drugs by that time, there was quite the library of prescription, maybe non-prescription. There were arguments to and fro. The FDA then said in 1972, well, let's begin amassing a review on all these different drug candidates. And so that's what they did. And now, just for perspective, there's over 300,000 different
Wow.
active ingredient over-the-counter drugs, and there are over 80 therapeutic categories, including, for instance, fluoride toothpaste or antacids even. And the details on what is allowed to be considered an active ingredient, what are the dosages, what are the formats that these can be in, and what kind of labeling should be on the packaging. Is there any testing that is normally shown, whether it's safety testing, whether it's efficacy testing, all that stuff tends to be stipulated pretty well in the monograph, and it's known in a published form as the Federal Register.
Okay, so understanding the relevant over the counter OTC monograph seems pretty important if one were to formulate, therefore, an OTC product.
Yeah, absolutely. With respect to over-the-counter products, at least there exists a starting point for recognized issues, and what that allows you to do is not have to worry that every time you have a brand new product, you have to submit like a new drug application or you're doing things brand new. No, there's some guidance. Here are some examples. With respect to fluoride in toothpaste, there's an anti-caries monograph. So the call for review on any kind of safety and efficacy testing based on various formulations, and this was whether it was from the manufacturer, whether it was clinical tests, laboratory tests done at universities or independent research organizations, they called for that beginning in 1980. A final monograph was then put forth in 95, amended in 96, and that is a final monograph that details what would be needed, what would be required to have an anti-caries drug claim. There are two other monographs, but they're pending. They have proposed rules and only, and they're not finalized yet. One of them has to deal with dental sensitivity, and that began in 1982. That call was, and there hasn't been proposed rules yet, but they do have proposed rules, not final rules, at least as late as 1991, early late, however you want to look at it. But we're now in 2025, and this is it. It's still going on. There's yet another monograph that has anti-gingivitis, anti-plaque instructions for labeling, maybe what proposed active ingredients are, and they actually categorize these ingredients, some of them as either tier one or tier three. Actually, they do this with the sensitivity too. We'll talk about these in another podcast, of course, but that's not finalized. And the most recent, really kind of instruction, kind of guidance, if you will, that you have is at least as late as 2003. So at least that one's more recent than the sensitivity, but it still hasn't been finalized. That can be problematic. It might not be, but it can be because if it's not finalized, how do you enforce certain labelings? And right now, there's a lot of craziness with respect to sensitivity and gingivitis or plaque claims. Even among scientists who agree about plaque and stuff, some don't agree that it's necessarily a drug kind of condition. Maybe gingivitis is, but plaque is, it can be considered that, but plaque's kind of normal. So, are you really going to get rid of all plaque anyway? I'm digressing a little bit there, but there's not as much of an oversight on those kinds of conditions, whether it's sensitivity or plaque or gingivitis, as there is with the caries, because they're not finalized. More attention needs to be had.
Okay, so would this also be an important starting point then for formulators?
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah, no doubt. Because now you have a monograph that can at least give you guidance on dosage, maybe the active ingredient and the format, as well as labeling guidelines. And that will all shape your claims and it probably will influence on how you choose to market this. But that's just that. Taking a step back, because we even mentioned some people don't want, for instance, fluoride in their toothpaste, then you would consider possibly that toothpaste to be a cosmetic. Not that, necessarily having fluoride is going to always be a drug, but at least in toothpaste, it's you can't just put low levels of fluoride in a toothpaste, even though it's below the over the counter, and say, well, look, I have a cosmetic. You can't do that. That's
Okay.
actually disallowed as well. So you have to follow labeling, and if you don't, you're going to be found in grievance of those conditions, which isn't the end of the world, but it is a huge paper trail and everything else. So, yes. So, starting with what you want to have in it, what kind of claims you would either progress and say, well, do you have a cosmetic or do you have a drug? If you have a cosmetic, then that might have you think of questions like just like how calcium can build strong bones. You have these structure function claims.
Mhm.
The FDA actually defines what a cosmetic is. They talk about, how it maybe can affect the appearance of the body. But you have to be really careful, and you also have to add additional language that says the FDA doesn't support this, it hasn't reviewed the data. And so there are some disclaimers that must be added. And even so, some of the structure function claims, it might seem like they're sensible, but there's some pitfalls there. There's also opportunities. I'm not trying to be negative about that, but don't be surprised if all of a sudden you get a letter from the FDA that says, "Hey, you have a dietary cosmetic, product, an ingredient, and you're making certain claims and is not, adhering to what we consider to be proper structure function claims for cosmetics."
It doesn't
So
sound, it sounds confusing. It doesn't sound very clear.
yeah, and it is, and the unfortunate thing is the FDA doesn't even have much oversight on that. And so right now it's really popular to get into the essentially what a lot of these toothpastes are cosmetics. If they don't have fluoride, they don't have all
Hmm.
these agents, maybe they have something like hydroxyapatite. Well, that's not necessarily a drug. And so you're having all these different kind of approaches into a toothpaste that kind of falls into a cosmetic. And if it falls into a cosmetic, well, they're not as rigorously bound to what kind of testing that
Okay.
they should be doing,
Hmm.
or, not only just with efficacy testing, but safety testing,
Wow.
you know? So if you go OTC, it's a good route to take. It allows you to follow a pathway put forward in the monograph, and a savvy formulator will recognize that the dosage will be tied to that. So, depending on if you want a fluoride mouthwash or if you want a toothpaste, there's going to be guidance even on that. There's going to be guidance on what the pH of those systems are going to be. So, it's very specific, and then it's going to be,
Vague.
pretty important. Well, it'll be vague if it's outside of that, but obviously it's easy to get into that. I think that it's really important to be able to point to established guidance on this.
Okay.
And, these monographs exist, but a lot of people just starting out, including students and stuff, they just don't even know they exist. There's professors at university that don't even know they exist. Or if they know they exist, they just say, well, I'm sure there's something that exists, and then they don't teach it. But, it kind of does a disservice if you don't, give some attention to it.
Right. Would it be fair to say then that the FDA would be the main regulating body of OTC?
Yes, absolutely, it would be. We'll be
Okay.
talking a little bit about the ADA, but yeah, I think if we had some, if there were other agencies that could probably step in and do some of the compliance work,
Mhm.
who's checking all
Absolutely.
if all these toothpastes are working?
Hmm.
I mean, some agency would have to do that. Sometimes you would have like consumer goods companies would do that. Sometimes you have small shops, independent shops that say, "Hey, look, well, we found in our tests that these ones perform the best." But again, you're always going to have inherent biases.
Hmm.
I mean, the ones that are doing these testings, maybe they slant more towards the more natural side. Or maybe they might slant more toward the drug side.
Hmm.
Maybe some of their funding comes from the big players,
Uh,
the big brands that we are already familiar with, and maybe that will influence some of the decisions, even if they say or doesn't. I mean, it's so hard not to have any kind of bias at all. That cannot be ignored. So because you don't know what you don't know, and this is actually one of the reasons why we're having this podcast, because it helps us figure out what that real world application is. There's a lot of talented people that are probably sitting on the sidelines. Maybe they're great at chemistry, maybe they're great at law, maybe they're great at or want to be involved in regulatory or even marketing. But having an opportunity to understand this aspect of this, and remember, there's over 300,000 OTC active ingredients in over 80 categories. So although we're focused on formulating with toothpaste,
mhm.
there's a wealth of other really important options out there for anybody who has an entrepreneurial bent, just an interest, or maybe
Mhm.
wants to get into this kind of thing. So, anyway, well, that's a little bit of a digress, but I think it's important because at least we can all point towards the monograph. We can say, okay,
Mhm.
the monograph exists. Well, we're telling you why it existed because there's, everything just evolves. But of course, you still have your professional agencies like The ADA, right? I
Mhm.
mean, that's what we were talking about, right?
So overall, it sounds like also what this podcast is trying hope to hopefully doing, it's helping to encourage the real world application of whatever science they may have already learned.
Yep. Yeah, that's right. Because you're not going to get that unless you're inside industry, unless you get that job in industry, you know? And that's
Right.
why, of course, once you're in the industry, it's easy to transfer among different players within that industry. And that's very common in the dental industry. You know, the dental industry is very small. You know, a lot of people because there's only so many people that are going to be, involving toothpaste in their
Right.
in their daily life and their daily discussions. So, but do you want to talk about the ADA?
Oh yeah, how does it fit in? And some products have an ADA seal, but is that related then to the FDA?
No, the ADA is separate from the FDA. Sometimes they align, sometimes they don't. Um, and to help understand the difference, let's discuss some key differences. Okay, again, the FDA has been established mainly their number one concern is safety, not efficacy, but safety. Now, I know maybe there's pushback. Well, pharmaceutical companies with a new drug, yeah, of course, and they have to show all the efficacy data. Of course, it has to be effective, but it has to be safe, number one. Number one. And number two, the FDA doesn't have the capacity, the bandwidth to chase all of the players that have, marketed products, even if they adhere to the monograph.
Hmm.
There's millions. Yeah, I'm exaggerating, but there's at least thousands, and it's probably on the order of hundreds of thousands of different small businesses or entities that have their products and they're putting them out there, whether it's in retail stores, brick and mortar, or even online. And so most are going to follow either an OTC, could be cosmetic. You're going to have few players that actually want to go a new drug application like what the pharmaceutical company does. Now, Colgate was the closest with that, right? They got approval for triclosan back in 97. And that was after four revisions. They started with their safety and efficacy review to the FDA in 92. And then, additional revisions were required. And that just continued on. I mean, 93, 95, 96, all of that, there were revisions. Ultimately, the FDA gave it the go ahead. They said, okay, your efficacy data looks good. Again, most of the concern was the safety. And so it's no surprise that then maybe in 2017, there were concerns that triclosan and cancer had a relationship, some kind of correlation that was a little bit more than not. And so the FDA said, okay, no products at all. I don't care whether it's a toothpaste or it's a soap or any kind of cleaning solution.
Okay.
We're going to pull triclosan from the market. So in the US market, right? Worldwide, it's whatever those agencies in that respective country are going to do. Oftentimes, they try to take the lead from the U.S., but not always. And so triclosan was pulled. So really, I believe that was the last time in the oral care that there was actually a new drug application process. And that's very secretive, though. You don't know. It's always unique, But if somebody has an idea for a toothpaste, you want to formulate, you want to have a new active that's outside the scope of the monograph agents that are listed.
Hmm.
And if it's not quite a cosmetic, but you yet want to have really good claims, go the NDA route. But it can tell you something that if the major players aren't necessarily pursuing that, then maybe that's probably not the best option. So the ADA has, its existence and they try to fill in the gaps, right? So we talked about the FDA doesn't have the bandwidth, right? You know about the seal, the ADA seal.
Right.
So
So
the ADA,
basically the gold standard.
yeah, well, the ADA seal is really, they issue the seal based on the guidelines that they put forth for various different categories. So if you want
Okay.
something for caries or if you want something for gingivitis, there's all different kinds of options to get the seal. You just got to follow their guidelines. They even have one for dental erosion, which is a condition not necessarily recognized by the FDA. That's for another topic, but that's kind of ingenious. I actually like that idea. But the ADA isn't going to volunteer and run all these studies. They want the manufacturer to convene with them.
Okay.
They'd say, oh, what's in your product? You got to tell us every ingredient. You got to give us all of that. We need the safety testing, we need efficacy testing, you know, and they're not necessarily going to be independent.
Okay. So are you? Are you saying that so do all companies need
No,
or
they don't need
have
it.
the
Nope.
ABA
Yeah,
seal?
they don't have it and they don't need it. No, really, I view it more as a tool for the marketers. If the marketers are trying to have their product kind
Mm-hmm.
of separate, distinguish themselves a little bit more from some of the other brands who may not have it.
Okay.
But sometimes, the fees, the economic conditions are just going to prove too much for the manufacturer. So for the ADA seal, I think it costs about $15,000 just for the application. Then you got to pay yearly maintenance fees to maintain that seal. Maybe they range $3,500. One may say, well, that doesn't sound like that much. Well, it can vary, and that's only on one product.
Whoa.
So if you have a company, say like Procter and Gamble or something, they have 10 toothpaste, are they going to get 10 toothpaste ADA seals for all and moreover, it's going to require a lot of the background testing that is normally not necessarily done. So,
That the manufacturer is
it's going to have to do anyway.
responsible for.
Yeah, so and sometimes it just doesn't make sense. For instance, it's even easier to get the anti-caries seal probably because there's an established monograph, than it is the gingivitis seal for the ADA, even though there's not a monograph in the FDA that has been finalized.
Yeah, which
Proposed,
doesn't
yeah.
make
I mean,
sense.
it can cost maybe upwards of 10 times or even 15 times more just because of what is needed to be able to do that. For instance, they would like two independent clinical trials. Whereas with the carries, you don't need to have any clinical trials. So so it can be a little bit frustrating sometimes. It
Hmm.
can, and then there's going to be, differences in guidelines and stuff. But honestly, sometimes I feel like even with these guidelines, improvements can still be made because there's sometimes a low bar on how to prove the efficacy, in which it kind of, again, not always, but for some of the guidelines that I've seen, it's almost like it runs antithesis to what the ADA is trying to do. Do you want safe and effective products or what? You know, don't lower the bar on
Right.
what you have, but that's that. And then, of course, the ADA is still comprised of dentists or dental researchers, and they're always going to have ties or interest to something,
Hmm.
whether they want to get an invite to give a lecture, or if they want a board seat, or they want to be
Hmm.
a consultant, just so, in other words, the potential for bias is always going to be there. Even if it's a nonprofit, the nonprofits, people who are at nonprofits, they still have agendas too, and they're human beings just like anybody at a for profit.
Right.
The nonprofit, again, we're not trying to trash any of these agencies, but we're also not trying to brand and, burnish them and polish them up and say, well, this is what we should do and this is the model. Is it better than what the FDA is doing? Yeah, because the ADA has the bandwidth on this. So, but that's just the reality of this. So no, you don't need to do and go through the ADA to get their approval or seal. The FDA puts forth monographs. You should follow it, and you better have that in your pocket whenever they come a running. But the thing that they're going to mostly look at is the quality of your systems. So, are you manufacturing or having these made in a manufacturer that adheres to good manufacturing
Okay.
practices? Are you following the labeling?
Hmm.
Or is your labeling somehow incongruent with what the monograph states, whether it's gingivitis, sensitivity, caries? Are you
Hmm.
making drug claims on your cosmetic? These are
Okay.
things that they're going to have a major issue with. Are you having too many disease claims on your product? That's what they're going to focus on. That falls more into safety, right? You don't want to try to, if you have mold growing on your countertop, there was a
Hmm.
warning letter that was issued to one of the big companies recently. There was mold on the premises, in and around the toothpaste making material. I mean, it just happens because things happen, but that is a safety concern. They're not going to
For
come and
sure.
ask you, okay, where's all your efficacy data? And we want to see all your independent clinical trials. And first of all, they probably won't be too many independent clinical trials, although there are some. So no. So all of these products, they can get the seal. I think it's more of a marketing avenue for the manufacturer. If they choose to get that, it might help, it might not. But and actually that reminds me. So back in the 1950s, you talked about the first fluoride toothpaste, right?
Hmm.
Back in the mid 50s, we were already talking about that previously.
Hmm.
So there was a return to that, and like with respect to false advertising. Of course,
Really?
Procter and Gamble got pulled into that cool game. I mean, a lot of the players did.
Hmm.
And the ADA was the one who really brought forth this attention to Congress. And so a special legislative session was called to
Okay.
discuss specifically some of the false, marketing that was going on in in the dental space, especially
Okay.
with respect to toothpaste. And so that was one of those things where, again, you're having these scientists that have their models and they may even have their own allegiances, but they're still trying to make this point. And they're trying to say, well, somebody needs to get a hold of what these manufacturers are saying.
Yeah. Oh, wait. So, a congressional hearing
Yeah.
on false marketing
Yeah.
of toothpaste.
Yeah. Yeah, I think in that congressional hearing they were looking at I mean I think they were looking at a couple different things like smoking was in there, weight loss drugs, and toothpaste made the list.
Okay.
Yeah. And so and the ADA was the one who really said, "Hey, look, we need help." And they got to them, and one of the reasons why it was brought to them is because they said we went to the Federal Trade Commission and the Trade Commission essentially punted.
Wait. So the FTC got involved, but then they didn't?
Yeah, they said, look there's not really a code for advertising necessarily about around toothpaste. And even if there was, and so we don't have enough funding to do all these other tests and to do all this checkup. So they said, we don't, who's going to pay for all this additional oversight that the ADA is calling for? And the ADA is also saying, we don't have enough funding. And the FDA is saying, well, we don't have the bandwidth, we don't have the funding. So everybody is asking the same thing. We need help where
Okay.
you're competing against companies with multi-million dollar advertising budgets. How do you compete with that? I bring this up because it's no different than what's going on today. Some people are really against some of the claims that are being made. Maybe
Okay.
not so much on television or even online, but there are mass media blitz.
Yes.
Oh my
Social
God.
media.
Yeah, so many different advertisements saying this is the best thing since fluoride, but actually they don't even know the actual date. They're using AI and they got it wrong. That's one of them. I think what it's Live Fresh, I think, is it right? In
Uh,
1914.
okay.
Yeah, but that's a whole nother in and of itself. That's where you're using, AI not for the good of things. And there's not enough fact checks. But
Okay.
anyway,
So, what was the resolution between all these governing organizations?
well, one of the things that they said was, well, the FTC, we're going to do our best to convene a conference so everybody can get together, meaning all the manufacturers get together and we can have a sit down. We can figure out what that code of advertising should look like. They're going to request scientific proof, efficacy, and safety of their products from the manufacturers, but they didn't necessarily require it. It's not like demanded, it was just request. And then they said, well, for
Good faith.
further, yeah, good faith. And
Okay.
then good act. And then, what you should do if you want further action is, I don't know, look up somebody else in Congress and figure out another legislative body. Good things were made though out of that. I'm not trying to poo-poo that or anything, but there was, all of these discussions, everything on the record, it's not pretty. These things are going to be ugly sometimes, you know, but there have been more, and there was great, I don't know if you want to say cooperation, but just like you said, the FDA relies on the faith of the manufacturer. They are really relying on the manufacturers to have
Wow.
good faith.
Wow. Improvements likely were made by getting together with these manufacturers and whatnot. But otherwise, it sounds like consumer based litigation is really what keeps these companies in check.
Yes, that is going to be the major check
Okay.
for all of these companies. Not only the consumer-based litigation, even though maybe our society is a little bit too litigious, especially with respect to certain areas and stuff, but also the competitors. So the
Mm-hmm.
competitors can oftentimes submit an anonymous
Mm-hmm.
note to the FDA saying, hey, somebody's doing dirty.
Mm-hmm.
We perceive that. Or they may, submit, and doesn't have to be anonymous. Cadbury didn't do that whenever they went against Wrigley. They just immediately said, hey, look, Wrigley's selling a product and we don't think they have the right backing on it. They didn't go to the FDA, they went to the Federal Trade Commission,
Okay.
and the advertising division got involved, and there was, interaction, with a council, the National Advertising Council, and you had participants and you have consultants and experts, and they had to talk about this, but
Hmm.
that's how these companies are going to stay in check. But you can think about it. Some of these new ones, oftentimes they're just,
Well, there's probably so many new entrants that you there's not even on the radar of
they're
these
not,
bigger companies. And
yeah, they're not even on the radar. And sometimes they're just trying to get those sales first, right? Because hey, once
Mhm.
you get the sales, the marketing, that always precedes litigation and regulation. Always, any industry. Just look at social media, for instance, even today. That's one of the reasons why so many people wanted to get into that. It wasn't regulated. It was brand new. It's a wild west. It's just like the internet era and the .com area of the 2000, early 2000, right? I mean, there wasn't regulation on that. So get there, try to make your goals or
Get your consumer
yeah,
base.
whatever that is, and then roll with it because regulations are going to come. Just get in there before it's going to be solidified. So I think it's all part of the game. So if you're an entrepreneur and you have an idea for a brand and you want to have a formulation that has certain ingredients in it, know this. Knowing all of this detail helps because that helps you craft your marketing, your strategy, the
Hmm.
testing that you might want to do, what's going to go in your toothpaste, who's going to make it. And it just allows you to focus on also what is coming down the pike. There's going to have to be a time plan that you got to meet because one day it's going to catch up to you. And that's just the way it goes. The problem with having some of these newer entrants though is what?
Well, I can't imagine that we can keep tabs on them regarding the safety or the efficacy. There's so
Exactly.
many that have hit Amazon even.
Yes, exactly. Especially those that are fluoride free and they would fall under the cosmetic category, right? And cosmetics are slowly, slowly trying to get regulated. A lot, cosmetic industry doesn't really want to be regulated. I think
Mhm.
that this is one area where the European Union is actually pushing the standards even more so than even here in the US.
Wow.
But you got to have your data. But still, it's one of those things where it's still nice to have. We're not requiring it.
Hmm.
Cosmetic is not going to require you to have two clinical trials. They're not going to want to, and they don't necessarily call forth, well, what is the stability of your formulation? How do you know your active ingredient, what you're calling an active ingredient, even if it is not a drug, but in your cosmetic, how do we know that it's active? How do we know it hasn't interfered with anything? How do we
That
know you don't have microbes living in your toothpaste and growing, especially mold? Mold's the number one problem
that's scary that that's still
because you're
not
not using the
regulated.
right preservative systems or because you say, hey, I want preservative free. Whoa, you
Uh,
better look out for your microbes.
wow.
I mean, everything has it. It's in our food, it's everything else. This is why sometimes, you hear about E. coli and sickness in food. It happens. The handling of food, whether it's produce, whether it's, even in a fast food, you have packaged contamination. These things are real. They happen. And
Preservatives are needed
yes,
definitely in certain systems
yeah, that's
for
another,
sure.
yeah, but that's another, obviously podcast and topic, but all of that goes into, you have to trust the manufacturer of your product. You have to make sure your claims are right. Don't overstate your claims if you have a cosmetic. If you have
Mhm.
a drug, make sure you adhere to what you're doing. Follow the players, follow the big players. I think that's probably one of my tips that I would suggest is definitely do that. Anybody who comes right out and says, "Oh, hydroxyapatite is better than fluoride," we'll talk about that. But you know what? Where's the data? Where's the data on that? And anybody would ask you the same thing. They would say, "Well, we want to know." And I know I'm probably going to get heat from this. I don't really care because there is no dosing. Then tell me what is the size of the HAP that is most beneficial? What is the dosing? What's your shelf life? And what is the standard testing that you would do to not only ensure that you have all that, but that it's proven to work? That stuff is not available like it is, for instance, for fluoride,
Okay.
and so
So,
that's why it's one of the, yeah, so that's why we're talking about this,
wow.
right? Mm.
So let's go back to fluoride toothpaste.
Yep. Yep.
Can you then give an example of some considerations that you need to take?
Well, let's say, about the toothpaste and fluoride, I would first ask about what your fluoride source is, and then I would ask what your dose is.
Okay, so let's say I want to go after maybe tooth decay or caries. as this ties into water
Oh,
fluoridation and
okay, right.
specs, stuff like
Yep.
that.
Yep. So you'd be looking at, yeah, what the disease claim is. So go after anti-carrier. So there's a monograph for that. So that's
Okay.
good. We can look at that.
So that's the one that was finalized, right?
Yep, that was,
1995?
yep, that's the one.
Okay.
That's the easiest one just to start with. And we would say, okay, we would look at there. We would find options for the fluoride source. So you would choose among those options.
Okay, so I have to, there's types of fluoride I have to choose, and then,
Yes.
well, I'm guessing dose, but
Yes.
there's types of fluoride?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, one cannot think of, hey, I want, I don't know, aluminum fluoride in my
Does that exist?
formulation. Yeah, it does. And actually, it's allowed in the European Union, but not in the US. The US only has three types of fluoride salts that are available for inclusion in an over-the-counter toothpaste.
So what are the three that the US recognizes?
Sodium fluoride, stannous fluoride, and sodium monofluorophosphate.
Okay.
And do you know that in Europe, there's about 20 different options? Yeah, and it's treated as a cosmetic, not as a drug, so it's not really regulated.
So they can choose to use whatever fluoride they want.
Well, they do. There are some, yeah. I mean, within those 20 different options. Funnily enough, though, it's so
Okay.
strange. They have magnesium fluoride and calcium fluoride, which are insoluble and do not really contribute a therapeutic level of fluoride that would be customary for like any kind of clinical reduction of anything. I'm not, we're not just talking about caries. I mean,
So
calcium fluorides and magnesium fluorides are insoluble.
so basically they might not be even effective.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, there's not listed models in the monograph because they are treating it as a cosmetic again, mostly for safety, even in the European Union, not necessarily for efficacy. Um, yeah, so that's a little discerning sometimes. Sometimes people are really surprised to learn that. So, but that's just what it is. And so, I mean, I remember, shoot, this is probably going back probably 15 years ago. I remember, and this isn't Europe, but it was Russia. I was given a Russian toothpaste, and they wanted to know what the fluoride availability was. Some manufacturer had bought different competitors' paste. They just wanted to run some testing because,
Okay.
we do some testing for some different companies,
What are they
right?
claiming was the
Oh no,
availability?
well, on the toothpaste, I didn't understand it because it was in
It
Russian,
was
but
Russians.
they put apparently they had put a ton of different minerals in there, anything that they thought that might help the tooth. So they had calcium in there, they had iron in there, they had stannous in there, they had fluoride in there, they had aluminum in, they had
Oh my
everything in
goodness.
there. Yeah, the amount of available fluoride that could actually be useful for like, in your body, like, well, not in your body, but in your tooth to actually do something. It'd be like, it's no different than if you take a 200 milligram ibuprofen tablet, you expect that 200 milligrams
You
to
want to get
be
rid of that headache.
available to be able
Yes.
to get rid of your headache. If you have something that has a certain amount of fluoride in it, like 1,000 ppm, you want as close to that 1,000 ppm to be available to be able to do the repair work to the tooth,
Absolutely.
right? So with this Russian, I think it was like less than 100 ppm. Oh my
Oh,
goodness. Yeah. So you could imagine that there could be problems, but it was by a manufacturer that wasn't one of the global present, wasn't the Colgates, it wasn't the
was
Procter and
okay.
Gamble, wasn't the Haleons, it wasn't one of the standard big companies that have been there and done that, that they're used to working with the FDA at least, probably ADA and obviously universities and other agencies all around the world. So,
Okay, so you mentioned the
um,
three that we have here in the US.
yes.
Um, I'm going to guess there's some main differences. What would those be?
Yeah, so you have sodium fluoride, stannous fluoride, and sodium monofluorophosphate, and two of them are pretty sensitive to abrasive selections. The sodium monofluorophosphate is most flexible because of the way that the fluoride is packaged. It's not as freely available as it is for stannous fluoride and sodium fluoride. So, because of its bonding environment, it's amenable to a variety of different abrasives. So you can use abrasives that include dicalcium phosphate if you want.
Okay.
That's an important one in the anti-gingivitis monograph, for instance. That one's sometimes listed. I think Colgate has one of those. Calcium carbonate is another one. Silicas, though, are predominantly used, and the silicas are best used for the sodium fluoride and sodium, or and the stannous fluoride because the silicas don't have anything that can attract the fluoride and reduce its availability to do
Okay.
work in the mouth. Sodium monofluorophosphate or MFP has no problem. You can use silica, you can use calcium carbonate, you can use kaolin if you wanted to. You could use sodium bicarb. Some people like baking soda toothpaste.
There must be a catch to using this source, though.
Well, there is, right? So sometimes manufacturers choose not to use it because of sourcing issues, maybe cost. Although clinical studies show that you get pretty equivalent efficacy, whether it's sodium fluoride versus MFP in a head-to-head. What if you're using ingredients that somehow hydrolyze and prematurely release that fluoride while it's sitting in the tube? Everybody wants the latest and greatest ingredients. Maybe they're not active ingredients, but maybe they're active
Right.
against something, right? It could be a part of a new flavor system. It
Hmm.
could maybe be part of some kind of, I don't know, a surfactant system or a hydrating, moisturizing system, and somehow it just happens to hydrolyze that. See, MFP is really unique. A lot of people don't know this. It requires enzymes in your mouth to break down that bonding environment
Okay.
in order to release the fluoride to then make it available.
So it's less likely to interact within the tube of toothpaste per
Yeah,
se.
in fact, yeah, and there are companies that definitely use that. I think Unilever is one of them that continued to choose to use the MFP, so they don't have any sourcing issues. Other ones, maybe they want to use it, but how you would assess the fluoride very easily is you would first have to use an acid or an enzyme that would break that bond, make the
Okay.
fluoride available, then and then measure it. For sodium fluoride and stannous fluoride, you don't have to do this additional step in order to measure the fluoride. You would just measure it directly. And so sometimes there's appeal from a manufacturer's point of view because they're all the time monitoring their products. Sometimes if you're trying to optimize products, you
Right.
just want the streamlined system. You just want to move forward with that.
Okay. So if I want to use, say, calcium carbonate
Yep.
or calcium phosphate as the abrasive, we talked about, those interactions, which fluoride would be best then?
If you want to use anything with calcium in it, I would say MFP. So let's just say MFP.
Okay.
So we would look in the monograph, we would say MFP. There's really not restrictions with the abrasives. The industry knows, again, mostly manufacturers know. I'm not going to tell you that all the dental professors out there at every university and do they know these differences? No, they don't. Maybe
Okay.
they're taught a little bit about some of the differences, but they don't know them intimately.
Mm-hmm.
They're not manufacturing,
Right.
and so they may not know fundamentally some of these different, nuanced differences of these ingredients, but in general, the manufacturers very well versed in the stuff. And so the monograph says for MFP, you can use it, but you can use levels between 850 and 1150. 850 and 1150 ppm. That has to be your labeled amount.
Okay.
And of that, at least 800 has to be available to do action on the tooth.
Okay. So that means that the minimum level needed to actually work within the mouth would then be that minimum 800 ppm of fluoride.
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
And that's usually over the course of an age period. So a lot of manufacturers like a 2-year shelf date. Sometimes they like a 1 year, And so what you would do is you make your formulation, you put it on stability testing. That could be accelerated conditions, 6 months or so can give you almost 2 years room temperature, for instance. We could talk about that again
Okay.
in further detail. But you would also want to do it room temperature because sometimes there's nuances of heating too that can lead to maybe some off-target reactions that you're not trying.
Mm-hmm.
Again, it depends on the complexity of the paste, right? For instance, a lot of people say, why do these manufacturers, it's year 2025 or whatever, why is everybody using sodium lauryl sulfate? Why do they keep, well, there's reasons for that. It's predictable, number one. Number two, it works. You know, maybe it doesn't work for you, but it works for the majority of humankind.
Mm-hmm.
And it works for their systems, their flavor systems, their abrasive systems, their humectant systems, different things that they want out of a toothpaste to be able to
Mm-hmm.
deliver. It works really well. So, but in general, yeah, you have to have more than 800. If you fall below 800, you do 750. So say for instance, a competitor takes up somebody's pace and they say, hey, they have MFP in here, and I just measured it, and it has 799 ppm. Is that falling outside the monograph?
Technically, I say yes.
Technically, it is. So that company potentially could send either anonymous or non-anonymous
Wow.
to the FDA, and the FDA could be alerted. The biggest concern with that, and why you wouldn't want to necessarily run afoul of that, is because, okay, so maybe somebody says you don't have the labeled amount. Maybe it was an issue of maybe during the formulating at scale, maybe somehow they didn't put in enough. Maybe it's
Okay.
that. So, in other words, maybe it's not some kind of binding, off target binding reaction that's binding it up. What you don't want is you don't want to have the FDA convening upon your property because the FDA's job, whenever they send in their inspectors, are to find problems. That is their that is
Yes.
their job
Yes.
because otherwise the consultants, if they say, "Well, I didn't find anything, everything was
No.
perfect."
No.
What are we paying you here for?
Right.
I mean, find something, anything. I don't care if a paper is like, not in the right place. Find something. There has to be something. Nobody's perfect.
Right.
And so what you don't want is you don't want to start building that history in the wrong way
Mm-hmm.
with the FDA, for
Makes
instance.
sense.
And so, yeah, so technically, yeah, so that's why it's always a good idea. Measure your own fluoride. At minimum, before you launch a product, if you have fluoride in it, you better measure the availability and also perform testing. We'll get to that in just a minute.
Okay, so you know that you have the right amount of fluoride,
Okay,
right?
good. Yep.
Okay, so that's not your toothpaste formulation.
No, we
So
have
what
to,
next?
yeah, we have to add components. So that includes abrasives, right? We're going to
Mhm.
add calcium carbonate, you thought,
Okay,
right?
right.
So add some of that. We'll put in some humectants. That keeps the paste looking and feeling moist and new whenever you have it dispensed out of the tube. It might help with mouthfeel, that includes like glycerin and sorbitol, things like that. You
Hmm.
then put in your binders, your flavors, your sweeteners, your surfactants, your solubilizers if you need to, because oils are sometimes challenging to dissolve in a water-based formulation. So sometimes you might use things like PEG 40, some kind of hydrogenated castor oil. But there's other newer options that still are
Okay,
derived from natural feedstock like sugarcane, maybe even corn, things
okay.
like this. But there's a lot of different things like that. And some ingredients you might want to put in there that might have a benefit. Some people like putting zinc in. Zinc can have benefits. There's also drawbacks, but some formulations will have zinc in them. You might have tartar control ingredients that might be in there. You might want to have different buffer systems for whatever reason. There's a lot that goes into this. So to be able to build out your chassis is really important because, and this is one of the reasons why once a manufacturer chooses their chassis, they really don't want to divert from that.
It's like the base.
It's like the base, that's what you started with. Let's just keep it going,
Okay.
because it's much harder, especially the bigger the the manufacturer is, it's much harder for them to retool all of their manufacturing and sourcing
Hmm.
and planning, the regulatory, all the, the label. I mean, all of that goes into all this. There's a lot that goes into this,
So at the beginning of our formulation, we made sure we have bioavailable fluoride. And then,
Yeah, we chose the fluoride,
right?
and then we'll monitor the fluoride, yes,
Okay.
throughout the formulation phase.
And you
That's
add
how
all
it
this other
should be done.
stuff.
That's
Okay.
how it should be done. Okay, that's how the big boys do it. That's how all the major players do it. These newer
Okay.
entrants and anybody who's, working at a contract manufacturer that just got the order for a fluoride, they're thinking that they can throw some ingredients together. Well, you should probably be measuring fluoride as you go.
Okay.
Does that tie into your next question about,
Yeah.
what do you
Okay.
do with the formulation once you have it?
We built it. We
Yeah.
have our toothpaste,
Yeah.
right? So most people will be like, we're ready for market, right?
Ready for market. Well, conform to testing. So the monograph for caries also says not only should you have a minimum amount of fluoride that's available to do work in the mouth,
Hmm.
you should have one of these two studies. It's either enamel fluoride uptake or it's enamel solubility reduction. Most really favor the enamel fluoride uptake. There's a reason why you would use enamel solubility reduction. I think that's just as important, if not more important. It's especially important for stannous fluoride. We'll talk about that in another podcast.
Okay.
But you should definitely do one of those. And while the agency requires animal caries test, like an actual clinical animal caries before you launch it, nobody does it.
Really?
Yeah, nobody does it. And though, because, well, first of all, there's a lot of pushback on animal use, right?
Which I understand.
Yeah, rightfully so. There are cycling models, there are different performance models that have become, well, they become as a surrogate, if you will. And these
Okay.
cycling performance models are tend to mimic what you would find clinically, whether it was in rats or hamsters, even to
Okay.
some degree humans. Like, if trying to mimic what your clinical outcome would be. And so, if those models, which are recognized, there's been published on,
Okay.
there's places that institute or that, deploy these models for testing purposes, you can use those.
Okay. So
Those are going to be acceptable. You don't necessarily have to submit them to the FDA to say, hey, is this okay that we did this and we didn't do that? But just have them in your docket, have them in your portfolio of your, creation, your toothpaste with all the rest of your data that all goes into it.
So this kind of testing, this is something, and I think we talked about this in a future podcast, but this is where you would refer to, say the IU School of
Oh,
Dentistry
yes, they would
or
be
maybe
excellent.
Intertech,
Intertech,
maybe
yes. Yeah, these
places to do
these
these
are
types of.
excellent venues for these. Yes, absolutely. And
Okay.
the added advantage of actually the IU School of Dentistry is they could do clinical studies. Intertech, I'm not sure. I think that they partner with universities if they're going to have some of that stuff done, they might. But then there's also independent, firms that also do clinical testing separately too. But that's another matter. And really, for caries, you don't have to do it.
Okay.
You know, yeah. So definitely have at least the baseline minimum test. And for fluoride availability, do that in your own premises. If you're a manufacturer, if you're your own brand, I don't care if you're large or small, you can do these. You can do these assessments in-house, especially because it's going to be just more synergistic. You'll be able to just flow through the formulation process. In fact, that's what we do, right? In our
Hmm.
formulations, whenever we're making or
We're
we're creating
constantly
a new
testing.
chassis, we're trying to say, okay, what if we did this? And you can't know all the time what is going to bind it up. You can use your best efforts and you can
Mhm.
say, well, I don't think this is going to do it, but what if you put an ingredient in there? What if there's a component in your flavor system
Yes.
or this new surfactant system
Hmm.
or this solubilizer system
No matter how minute.
that might bind it up.
Hmm.
What if there are trace amounts of some kind of impurity?
Okay.
You know, so impurities do matter too. So then that also goes into your sourcing.
Hmm.
There's the same concerns that anybody would have with their food, and if you're making a lotion or a cream, any kind of formulation, all of that is going to matter. You hope that what you're getting is going to be what you're going to get. But all of that, though, goes for additional podcast topics that we'll be talking about
Yes.
absolutely in the future.
Yes.
So, right now, so at least we talked about a toothpaste, right? Just an
Hmm.
example one. We use MFP, a little bit unusual, not really discussed a whole lot. We'll be talking about some other ones as we go. We'll
Okay.
give some case studies and some examples, but I think that this is a great intro to understanding first, know your federal register, know your FDA. Everybody wants to have a product sold in the US. Everybody does. We have customers from and clients from outside the US that are saying,
Hmm.
hey, can you formulate
Absolutely.
this? We want this market. The US is still and will be always be a major market for this. The US typically leads in regulation,
Hmm.
you know. Maybe some countries have more strict regulations around certain things, but in general, they usually follow whatever the US government has done in terms of from a regulatory perspective. Again, usually, not always, there's always going to be
Right.
exceptions to all this, but from a formulation perspective, at least from an oral care perspective,
Hmm.
I think that their monograph for over-the-counter drugs definitely unsurpassed, right? In terms of, well, what is allowed? Could it be improved? Of course, it could be improved. All these things could be improved, but I digress. So with that, that concludes this podcast. Hey, we thank you for listening. And if you have questions or comments, feel free to reach out to us because that may make one of the topics that we end up talking about one day,
Absolutely.
And these things are important. If you have that question, maybe somebody else does,
Most
because
likely.
really once you get into this, there is so much. This is a rabbit hole of stuff. And somebody might say it's just toothpaste, but
No.
and that's just toothpaste. We haven't even talked about mouthwashes. We haven't talked about other aspects of stuff, but we
Sprays,
will.
varnishes,
Sprays, varnishes,
everything.
devices, professional stuff. And that's another thing. The monograph also has a whole separate monograph for prescription strength
Right.
topical fluorides. We'll save that for another time, right?
Hmm.
All right. So, alongside Tammy, I'm Dr. Rob. Again, thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.